for the murder of her roommate in Italy.
Most of her life in prison for the brutal murder of my son, Christopher.
Being arrested for a crime is one thing. Being convicted for one you did not do is something else entirely. These women lost years, sometimes decades, locked away while the real evidence sat ignored, buried, or in the hands of people who already knew the truth. Some were teenagers, some were grieving mothers. All of them eventually walked free, but only after fighting a system that refused to listen. These are some of the youngest women in modern history to be wrongfully convicted, and the moments their freedom finally came. Amanda Knox.
Seattle's Amanda Knox is on a journey. 18 years since she was wrongly arrested for the murder of her roommate in Italy.
In November 2007, British exchange student named Meredith Kircher was found dead in the apartment she shared with 3 other young women in Perugia, Italy. Meredith had moved to Italy that fall to study at the University of Perugia for the year. Her cottage on Via della Pergola was a 4-bedroom split between her, 2 Italian women in their late 20s who worked in town, and 1 American student. That American was a 20-year-old from Seattle named Amanda Knox, who was a few months into her own year abroad at the University for Foreigners. On the night of 1st November, Meredith spent the evening with friends, came home around 9 p.m. and went up to her bedroom. By morning, she was dead. Amanda walked back into the apartment around midday on November 2 after spending the night at the home of her new Italian boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito. She found the front door open, a window in another bedroom shattered with glass everywhere, and droplets of blood smeared in the bathroom. She called her mom, then she called the police. When officers reached Meredith's bedroom, they found her on the floor with her throat cut, partially covered by a duvet, with stab wounds across her body and defensive slashes on her hands. The broken window made it look like a burglary, but the glass was sitting on top of the clothes, which is the kind of thing that happens when someone breaks a window from the inside to stage a fake break-in. That single detail set the tone for everything that came next. When officers met Amanda outside, she was acting in ways that investigators thought a normal grieving roommate would not. She was kissing and cuddling Raffaele in the parking lot. She did a couple of cartwheels in the police station while waiting to give a statement. So instead of treating her like a witness, they treated her like a suspect. She was put through a 3-hour stretch of questioning. A lot of it ran overnight, much of it happened with no lawyer in the room, and most of it was conducted in Italian, a language she barely spoke. By the end of it, Amanda had signed a statement placing herself in the apartment that night and accusing her boss, a Congolese bar owner named Patrick Lumumba, of being the killer. That statement would haunt her for the next 2 decades. Lumumba was arrested, then released within hours when his alibi held up. The damage to Amanda was already done because the police had their story. Prosecutors took it from there and built a theory that Meredith had been killed during some kind of sex game gone wrong, with Amanda and Raffaele as the masterminds. The physical evidence said something completely different. DNA from a man named Rudy Guade, a small-time drug dealer who knew the 4 young Italian men living in the apartment downstairs, was all over the crime scene. His handprint was found in Meredith's blood, pressed onto a pillow underneath her body. His DNA was inside her body. His bloody sneaker prints led out of her room. Guade fled to Germany right after the killing and got caught a couple of weeks later trying to ride a train without a ticket. When questioned, he tried to throw the blame around, but the forensic story made it pretty obvious he was the one who had attacked her. He was tried separately on a fast-track basis and sentenced to 30 years. Italian prosecutors pushed forward against Amanda and Raffaele anyway. In December 2009, after a trial that drew media from every corner of the globe, both were convicted. Amanda got 26 years. Raffaele got 25. The case against her hinged on 2 slivers of evidence. A kitchen knife from Raffaele's apartment said to carry trace DNA, and a bra clasp recovered from the floor of Meredith's room about 6 weeks after the crime. Independent forensic experts who reviewed the work later found basic contamination errors and procedures that would have failed any modern lab. In October 2011, an appeals court tore the convictions apart. Amanda walked out of prison after nearly 4 years inside and flew home to Seattle within hours, with her family closing around her at the airport like a wall. Then, Italy's High Court ordered a do-over. In 2014, a Florence appeals court reinstated the guilty verdicts, this time bumping Amanda's sentence up to 28 years and 6 months. She refused to come back to Italy and waited it out from the United States. Finally, in March 2015, after roughly 10 hours of deliberation, Italy's Court of Cassation issued a final ruling. The convictions were annulled with prejudice, which means the case could never be reopened. The judges later wrote that the investigation had been deeply flawed at almost every step, with sloppy forensic work and a rush to judgment driving the original conviction. Amanda was 27 years old. She had spent close to 4 years of her early 20s in an Italian prison for a crime the physical evidence had pointed elsewhere from day one. She has since become an author, a podcaster, and a producer on a Hulu series about her own life. The slander conviction tied to her false accusation of Lumumba was upheld again in 2024 by Italy's highest court, so her name is not fully clear in the Italian system, but the murder charge that stole her 20s is gone for good. Sandra Hem.
Out of the Chillicothe Correctional Center, a free woman after spending most of her life in prison for...
On the morning of the 13th of November 1980, a 31-year-old library worker named Patricia Jeschke did not show up to her job at the St. Joseph Public Library in St. Joseph, Missouri. Patricia was the library's secretary. She was quiet, dependable, and lived alone in a small one-story duplex on the east side of town. So when she missed her shift without calling, her boss tried the house and got nothing. Her mother got the same nothing. Her mom drove over to the duplex, found the doors locked tight, and ended up breaking a window to climb inside. She found Patricia on the bedroom floor at 1 in the afternoon. Patricia had been beaten and stabbed in the back of the head, strangled with a ligature pulled tight around her neck, and left with her hands bound behind her back. Police found a couple of black hairs near her body and 2 short lengths of cut antenna wire on the floor beside her. The killer had taken the time to bind her, which meant this was a slow, deliberate attack. Whoever did it had been there a while. There were no signs of forced entry. The case quickly went cold, but only briefly, because police soon focused on a 20-year-old woman with severe mental illness named Sandra Hemme. Sandy, as her family called her, had been a psychiatric patient since she was 12 years old. At the time Patricia was killed, Sandy was a patient at St. Joseph's State Hospital, heavily medicated, restrained, and going through hallucinations. She had been discharged briefly on the morning of November 12 after asking for help with amphetamine misuse, then readmitted. She had no connection to Patricia. The two had never crossed paths, and there was no motive anyone could come up with. But detectives questioned her anyway, over and over, while she was still on antipsychotic drugs. Court records later showed Sandy was so sedated during the first interviews that she could not hold her head up or give answers longer than a single word. Her statements were wildly contradictory and at times factually impossible, so she placed herself at scenes that did not exist, in cars that did not match anything real, and her accounts changed every time officers came back. She also went through 8 separate sessions of questioning. At one point, she named a man called Joe Wabsky as the killer. Police later found out Wabsky had been out of state on the date of the murder, with an alibi tighter than concrete. One detective named Stephen Fuston eventually testified that he stopped one of his interviews early because Sandy was simply not coherent enough to give a reliable statement. The case kept moving forward anyway. There was no physical evidence linking Sandy to the crime scene. The 2 black hairs near Patricia's body were tested and excluded her. The cut antenna wire matched nothing she owned. Nobody saw her near the duplex. Still, in April 1981, under pressure and on the advice of her attorney, Sandy pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life without parole. A new trial was ordered after she withdrew the plea, but at the 1985 retrial, she was convicted again. This time she received life with no chance of parole for 50 years. The whole trial lasted 1 day. Here is where it gets strange. Around the same time, investigators were leaning on Sandy. St. Joseph police officer named Michael Holman became a person of interest in his own department. Holman drove a white Ford pickup with a roll bar and a black grille. Neighbors had seen that exact truck parked outside Patricia's duplex the night she was killed. A clerk at a camera shop in Kansas City identified Holman as the man who had tried to use Patricia's credit card the day her body was found. His alibi was that he had been at a motel across the street from her apartment with a woman he called Mary. The motel owner pulled the guest list for that night, and Holman was not on it. When police searched his house, they found a pair of gold horseshoe-shaped earrings in a closet. Patricia's father identified them as a pair he had bought for his daughter. A chief named Lloyd Pasley was overseeing the original investigation. He concluded Holman was the real killer. But the case against Holman ended abruptly after 4 days, with no charges and no public explanation. Holman quietly went on with his career, was later fired for an unrelated offense, and was convicted of insurance fraud. He died in 2015 without ever being charged for Patricia's death. For more than 40 years, the evidence pointing at him sat in police files, hidden from Sandy's attorneys. The Innocence Project finally took her case in 2018. Years of motions, hearings, and document fights followed, with Missouri's Attorney General aggressively opposing her release at nearly every step, even after a judge had already found her innocent. On the 14th of June 2024, Livingston County Judge Ryan Horsman ruled in a 118-page memorandum that Sandy had proven her actual innocence. He wrote that no evidence outside her own unreliable statements connected her to the crime, while the evidence directly tied Holman to it. After several attempts by the Attorney General's office to keep her behind bars, the Missouri Supreme Court declined to interfere, and, on the 19th of July, 2024, Sandy walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Center. She had been incarcerated for 43 years, the longest known wrongful imprisonment of a woman in American history. She was 64 years old. Within 10 days of her release, her father, who had been hospitalized with kidney failure, passed away. She at least got to be at his bedside. She moved in with her sister and brother-in-law in Higginsville, Missouri, and spent her first months on the outside relearning everything, from the way cell phones work to the price of a gallon of milk. Deborah Milker.
I had absolutely nothing to do with the brutal murder of my son, Christopher. And I did not give a confession to Mr. Soldati.
In December 1989, in Phoenix, Arizona, an insurance worker named Deborah Milk dressed her 4-year-old son, Christopher, in his favorite outfit, a Triceratops sweatshirt and a little pair of cowboy boots. Christopher had blonde bangs and dark eyes, and he had been excited all morning because his mum told him he was going to see Santa Claus at the mall. He had actually gone to see Santa the day before too, and he had asked his mother if he could go again. So when her roommate James Stiers offered to take him on Saturday, December 2, the plan looked completely normal from the outside. Stiers was a Vietnam veteran who had been subletting a room to Deborah and Christopher. On the way to the mall, he picked up a friend named Roger Scott. Instead of going to the mall, the two men drove Christopher out past the city limits, toward a far northwest stretch of Phoenix desert. They told the boy they were going to look for snakes. In a dry desert wash near the edge of town, one of them walked Christopher into the brush and shot him 3 times in the back of the head from close range. He was found the next day curled in a fetal position in the wash, with the chewing gum he had been chewing that morning still wedged between his teeth. The motive, according to prosecutors, was a $50,000 life insurance policy on the child, plus a desire to be free of motherhood. Stiers and Scott did not just confess on their own. After Christopher disappeared, the two men drove to Metro Center Mall and told a security guard that the boy had wandered off. Police pulled them in because something about the story did not add up. Within roughly 14 hours of questioning, Scott broke. He admitted he knew where Christopher was, and he led detectives out to the desert wash where the body lay. Once those two were in custody, attention turned to Deborah. Both men, while talking openly about their own roles, refused to say she had ordered the killing. Scott said she had wanted it done. Stiers said she had no involvement whatsoever. Neither of them would ever testify against her at trial. Not at her trial, not during her appeals, and not later, when both sat on death row themselves with nothing to lose. So what sent her to death row was a single conversation she allegedly had with one detective. Phoenix Police Detective Armando Saldate Jr. interviewed her alone at the Pinal County Sheriff's Office about an hour from Phoenix. The conversation went totally undocumented. He kept 0 notes during the talk, walked in without recording equipment, and the room held only the two of them. After about 30 minutes, Saldate came out and said she had confessed. She has always denied it. She has always said the only thing she ever told him was that she was innocent and that she wanted a lawyer. The trial in 1990 became, in the words of one federal judge years later, a swearing contest. The jury had to decide whether to believe a young mother saying she had nothing to do with her son's death, or a veteran detective saying she had calmly admitted to ordering it. They believed the detective. Deborah was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, and child abuse, and she was sentenced to die. The jury never heard that Detective Saldate had a long, documented record of dishonesty. He had been suspended for 5 days for taking what was described as liberties with a female motorist he had pulled over, and then lying about it to his supervisors. 4 separate confessions or indictments had been thrown out by other judges because Saldate had lied under oath. 4 more confessions had been suppressed because he had violated suspects' constitutional rights during interrogations. All of that stayed buried, far away from her defense team. She spent 22 years on Arizona's death row. The Arizona Supreme Court even issued an actual death warrant for her in 1997, but the execution was put on hold because her federal appeals were not yet finished. In 2013, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals tore the conviction apart in a sharply worded opinion. Chief Judge Alex Kozinski wrote that no civilized system of justice should ever depend on such flimsy evidence. Arizona was given one chance to retry her without Saldate's testimony, but the detective himself refused to testify again, citing fears of federal perjury charges, so the case fell apart. In March 2015, all charges were formally dismissed by Judge Rosa Mroz. Deborah was now 51 years old. She had been free on bond since 2013, walking around with an ankle monitor while the appeals played out. She became the second woman in American history to be exonerated from death row. The 2 men who actually killed her son, Stiers and Scott, stayed on death row for years. Stiers died there in 2022. Scott is still alive as of the latest court records. Joyce Watkins.
Reversing a guilty verdict can be all but impossible.
In the early hours of the 27th of June 1987, a woman in Nashville, Tennessee, named Joyce Watkins, rushed her 4-year-old great-niece Brandy to the emergency room. The little girl had been in Joyce's care for less than 9 hours. The night before, Joyce and her boyfriend, Charlie Dunn, had driven the roughly 75 miles from Nashville up to Kentucky to pick Brandy up from a relative who had been keeping her for the previous 2 months. That relative had called Joyce in a panic, saying she could no longer take care of the child. Joyce, who was working a full-time job and was actually in the middle of applying to adopt a child of her own, did not even think twice. She got in the car. She and Charlie picked Brandy up that evening. The little girl was quiet and lethargic in the back seat on the drive home, but 4-year-olds get tired late at night. When they got back to Nashville, Brandy went straight to sleep on the couch. When Joyce checked on her in the morning, something was very wrong. Brandy was unresponsive, barely breathing, and her body was limp. Joyce also noticed blood on the child's underwear, a horrifying sign before they even reached the hospital. At Nashville Memorial, doctors found Brandy had suffered severe head trauma, including a linear skull fracture, along with signs of sexual assault. She was pronounced dead the next day. The medical examiner on the case, Dr. Gretel Harlan, concluded almost immediately that the injuries had to have happened within those 9 hours. Brandy was with Joyce and Charlie. That timeline was the whole case. The state had no eyewitness, no confession, and no physical link between Joyce or Charlie and the injuries the child had suffered. There was just a doctor's opinion that the harm had to have come from the only adults the girl was with that night. In 1988, both Joyce and Charlie were convicted of aggravated rape and felony murder. Joyce had no prior criminal record. She was a respected member of her community. She was sentenced to life in prison. She was 40 years old when the door closed behind her, and she would not walk out for the next 27 years. Joyce never stopped saying she had nothing to do with Brandy's death. She wrote letters. She filed for post-conviction relief in 1993 and was denied. Charlie filed too and was also denied. The two of them spent the next 2 decades watching their appeals fail, one after another. Charlie died inside a Tennessee prison in January 2015, still officially branded a child rapist and a murderer. He never got to hear the word innocent spoken about him in a courtroom. Months after his death, Joyce was paroled, but she walked out as a registered sex offender, still legally branded a child rapist and a murderer in the eyes of the state. So she just kept fighting. In 2021, she walked into the offices of the Tennessee Innocence Project and asked them to listen to her story. Their senior legal counsel later said it took only minutes in a room with her to realize there was no way she had committed the crime she was convicted of. The team partnered with the Davidson County District Attorney's Conviction Review Unit, a small group inside the DA's office set up specifically to look at potentially wrongful convictions. The medical science used to convict her had been badly wrong. Modern forensic pathologists who reviewed the case agreed that Brandy's fatal injuries, particularly the head trauma and the internal injuries, were not consistent with the 9-hour window prosecutors had built their case around. The bruising patterns and the stage of healing on some of the injuries pointed to harm done days earlier, not hours. There were strong signs the abuse had happened before Brandy ever got into Joyce's car during the 2 months she had been staying with that relative in Kentucky. Dr. Harlan's original timeline, the spine of the entire prosecution, simply did not hold up. On the 12th of January 2022, Judge Angelita Blackshear Dalton vacated the convictions and dismissed all charges. District Attorney Glenn Funk stood in the courtroom and said openly that Joyce Watkins and Charlie Dunn were innocent. Joyce was 74 years old. She told reporters afterward that the system had cost her half her life for nothing, but she would get over it. Joyce has spent the years since traveling to speak about wrongful convictions, often alongside Charlie's family, who finally got to hear his name cleared too. She was eventually removed from the sex offender registry, which had followed her around even after parole, making her one of the rare exonerees who has had every layer of the original punishment lifted. Michelle Murphy.
I'm grateful to all the people for always believing in me.
Around 6 in the morning on the 12th of September 1994, single mother in Tulsa, Oklahoma, named Michelle Murphy ran out of her townhouse and started banging on her neighbor's door. She was screaming for help. Inside her apartment, on the kitchen floor, her 5-week-old son Travis was lying in a pool of his own blood. He had a puncture wound to the chest and a deep slash across his throat that had nearly decapitated him. Police arrived within minutes. Michelle was hysterical, covered in her own blood from a small cut on her hand, and she told officers she had no idea what had happened. She had been asleep in the other room with her 2-year-old daughter when she heard a noise. She had recently separated from her husband. She was working through a high school equivalency program and trying to build something for her kids. So that should have been the start of a careful investigation. Instead, she ended up in a long interrogation with Detective Mike Cook of the Tulsa Police Department. Hours into the questioning, with no parent and no lawyer in the room, Michelle made a statement that would destroy the next 2 decades of her life. She said she had accidentally stabbed Travis when she knelt down to pick up a knife after dropping something. She would later say she only said it because the detectives told her she could go home if she did. She did not even have the cognitive room to argue with them. She was a teenager who had just found her baby dead and had been awake for almost a full day. She did not go home. She was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's other major piece of evidence was the blood at the scene. A criminalist from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation testified that the blood found in the kitchen was consistent with Michelle's and her son's blood types. That was a lie, or at the very least, a serious omission. The lab's own internal records showed that the bloodstains included type AB blood. Travis was type O, Michelle was type A. Neither of them could have been the source. Someone else had bled inside that apartment the night Travis was killed. Prosecutors had those records the entire time. They were never given to her defense team. There was also a teenager named William Lee who lived in the apartment complex and had a history of issues that put him on the radar of investigators, but he was never seriously pursued. In November 1995, an 18-year-old, Michelle was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her 2-year-old daughter was taken from her and adopted by another family. The prosecutor who had just convicted her was the same official who signed off on the adoption. For more than 15 years, a teacher named Susan Jones, who had taught Michelle while she was studying for her high school equivalency, refused to believe she was guilty. So Susan kept pushing, kept writing letters, kept looking for lawyers who would take the case. In 2011, she found Tulsa attorneys Richard and Sharice O'Carroll. They opened the old file and started pulling at threads. When they discovered the blood type discrepancy buried in the OSBI lab notes, they realized the entire case had been built on a foundation that simply did not exist. The Innocence Project joined the team in early 2014. Modern DNA testing was finally run on the blood from the scene. The results showed the DNA of an unknown male, someone who was not Michelle, not Travis, and not her ex-husband. On the 30th of May, 2014, Judge William Califf vacated her conviction. She walked out of prison that same day on a $10,000 bond. On the 12th of September 2014, exactly 20 years to the day after her son's death, the charges were formally dismissed and the judge officially declared her innocent. She received $175,000 in compensation from the state of Oklahoma the following year. She became the first and only woman in Oklahoma to be exonerated through DNA testing. She has since reconnected with the daughter who was taken from her, rebuilt a relationship that prison and adoption had ripped apart, and become a public voice on coerced confessions through the Innocence Project. Sabrina Butler Smith.
You're sitting there waiting for them to kill you.
On the night of the 11th of April, 1989, in Columbus, Mississippi, Sabrina Butler checked on her 9-month-old son, Walter. He was not breathing. She picked him up, ran to a neighbor for help, and when the neighbor could not do anything, she got into a car with another young woman who started doing chest compressions on the baby as they drove toward the hospital. Sabrina did CPR too. She had never been trained. Walter had an undiagnosed condition called polycystic kidney disease, which can cause sudden cardiac and respiratory failure in very young children. His body was already shutting down before she ever picked him up that night. At the hospital, doctors tried for 30 minutes to bring Walter back. He was pronounced dead. The next morning, Sabrina went to the police station because investigators had asked her to come in. She was 17. She had no parent with her. She had no attorney. The detective who interviewed her later wrote down a statement saying that she had stepped on Walter and slammed him to the ground. She has always said those words came from him, not her, and that she signed it because she was a terrified teenager who had just lost her son. The autopsy noted bruises across Walter's torso, the marks of the panicked, untrained CPR she and the neighbor had performed in those frantic minutes. The doctors who tried to revive him at the hospital had also done chest compressions, which left their own marks. Mississippi prosecutors saw those bruises and saw a child killer. Sabrina was charged with capital murder. In March 1990, she went on trial in front of an all-white jury with a public defender who barely fought for her. She testified in her own defense, but her attorney did not call a single expert to explain what untrained CPR can look like on an infant. She was convicted and sentenced to die. She was 18 years old when she walked onto Mississippi's death row, where she was one of only 2 women in the entire state held in the death unit. The other was a woman named Susan Balfour. Officials reportedly did not even know where to put them, so for a time the 2 women were separated from the male inmates by a piece of tape on the floor. She spent 2 years and 9 months on that row, with an execution date already set, before her case was finally taken seriously. In 1992, the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled that the prosecution had not even properly proven that the baby's death was a murder, much less that Sabrina was responsible. She got a retrial. This time, her attorneys actually worked the case. They brought in the neighbor who had performed CPR alongside her to explain where the bruises had come from. A medical examiner testified that he had reconsidered his findings and that the most likely cause of Walter's death was the polycystic kidney disease, not abuse. On the 17th of December 1995, the jury at the retrial returned a not guilty verdict. Sabrina was 25 years old. She had spent 6.5 years in prison for a death that turned out to be a natural medical event, with 2 years and 9 months of those on death row. She became the first woman in American history to be exonerated from death row. Her reaction in that courtroom was raw. She broke down at the defense table, weeping hard into her hands as the verdict was read. Years of being called a child killer by every guard, every inmate, every stranger who recognized her name, evaporated in a single sentence from a foreman she had never met. She has since become one of the most public anti-death penalty voices in the country, traveling with the group Witness to Innocence and speaking at universities and law schools. She also became a mother again and a grandmother in the decades after her release, building back something close to the family she had been denied as a teenager. In interview after interview over the years, Sabrina has explained that the bruises everyone pointed to as proof of abuse were the same ones any panicked, untrained person leaves on a baby when they are trying to keep a tiny chest moving and a tiny heart beating. So in her case, what looked like cruelty was actually the last thing a desperate young mother could do for her child. Melissa Lucio.
Was caused by an accidental fall down a flight of stairs.
On the 17th of February 2007, in Harlingen, Texas, a mother of 14 named Melissa Lucio called for an ambulance. Her 2-year-old daughter Mariah was unresponsive on the floor. Paramedics could not revive her. At the hospital, doctors noted heavy bruising and what looked like a bite mark on the little girl's body. 2 days earlier, the family had been moving out of their second-floor apartment. Mariah, who had a mild physical disability that affected her balance, told about Melissa's documented history of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse from her own childhood, which experts later said made her especially vulnerable to false confessions. She had been diagnosed with PTSD, battered woman syndrome, and depression, and she had documented intellectual impairments, all factors that put her into the category of suspects most likely to falsely confess under pressure. Her husband, Robert Alvarez, who had a documented history of violence and was equally responsible for Mariah's care, was convicted only of failing to intervene and given 4 years. Melissa got death. She spent nearly 15 years on Texas's death row before the case began to draw national attention. In 2020, French documentary filmmaker Sabrina Van Tassel released a feature called The State of Texas versus Melissa, which laid out the suppressed evidence and the medical questions in plain detail. Politicians from both parties in Texas began publicly questioning the conviction. A bipartisan group of state lawmakers traveled to the prison in Gatesville to meet her in April 2022, just weeks before her scheduled execution. Even reality television star Kim Kardashian took up the cause and helped get her story in front of millions of people who otherwise would never have known her name. On the 25th of April, 2022, just 2 days before Melissa was set to be put to death, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay and sent the case back down for review. In April 2024, Senior State District Judge Arturo Nelson, the same judge who had presided over her original trial, ruled that prosecutors had illegally suppressed evidence pointing to an accidental fall. In October 2024, he went further, finding clear and convincing evidence that Melissa was actually innocent. He wrote that no rational juror, given the full record, would have convicted her, and that her confession should never have carried the weight it did. The recommendation now sits with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which has the final word on overturning the conviction. As of the latest filings, her family is still waiting on that final ruling. Melissa herself, speaking from prison after the innocence finding, said only that there were no words for what she felt.